do church shopping, but you like did like religion shopping, right? You just threw everything up and dug around. Would you, those people who are sort of in a tradition, would it be, I guess the question is, to what advantage is there to explore your tradition down to its core, or to gain some breadth in understanding the traditions of others? Can you follow a multiplicity of traditions to a degree of depth that's going to provide some real peace for you, you know, kind of going broadly like you have described your own self-journey, or have you talked to people you think it's better to stick with a tradition and try to get into the heart of it and then there to find its wisdom? How would you advise somebody in that kind of way?
I can really only say how it worked and didn't work for me, because I think if my approach was kind of shotgun. You know, let's go everywhere, see what I can gather, and essentially that was to bring this back to kind of the core of my message. That was a third-person approach. I wanted to know, right? So intellectually, I wanted to understand what it was that I was exploring. And then what happened was the second-person approach toward kind of devotional stuff only caught with ones that resonated. In other words, if it didn't resonate on the third person, if I couldn't look at it and go, wow, there's something there for me, I couldn't go into that second-person devotional space of, I'm going to let this in.
Yeah.
It was only when I found an explosive relevance with Zen, actually, that it took me into first person. And at that point, I committed wholly. Totally.
Yeah.
And I have since kind of, I've left the tradition, not because I have anything, I think it's the coolest thing around. I think it's marvelous. I also think Christianity is, they are all profoundly rich in their guidance. And I think if you take Christianity to its core, you're going to understand exactly what the Vedanta tradition is going to say at its core, what the Buddhist tradition is going to say at its core. The metaphor that I'm using with my hands goes down, but actually what we're talking about here is the mountain of spirit. So climbing that mountain, doesn't matter what path you take down.
Right.
It's that you take the path and you keep climbing, and as the altitude gets higher, you have to let go of more and more stuff. And the more stuff you let go of, when you finally have let it all go, you will find miraculously that you have summited. And then the real work is coming home.
Yeah. That's helpful. Did you hear that? So I think what I'm hearing you say is that it's not so much about which tradition I'm on, but can I identify sort of the layering effect that's going on? If I'm stuck in third person as an objective, well, that looks okay, but I don't know, it's highly critical. Or, yes, I'm beginning to see that I'm giving myself to it. Or I become, like we had this conversation when we got started, we talked about, I am the Christ. When you enter into Christianity at that level, then you arrive. So it doesn't. The tradition doesn't matter as much to you as the almost person identification you're having with it. Sounds like a better description of what you're describing.
Christ consciousness,
Buddhist
enlightenment, whatever you want to call enlightenment, is all about letting go.
Yeah.
And then acting from that place of deep resonant peace, that deep resonant surrender, engaging from that place. It doesn't mean you become a spiritual couch potato. On the contrary, you are incredibly engaged with the world from a place of, your work is to be helpful.
Yeah, yeah. Did that answer you guys? That helpful?
I'd like to, if I
go ahead, and then I got one for you
too. A couple of equal time, I guess.
Yeah, you can follow up, and you can talk to them too.
Well,
you don't have to talk to me.
I think again, it points out some of the differences between Eastern and Western perspectives.
Right.
I think the notion "I am Christ" also, from a certain point of view, can become pathological. There's an inflation.
Yeah, talk about that.
If it's coming from the ego's standpoint, well, we are not the Christ. There's a difference there. There's a relationship there. We are realizing the Christ, perhaps. So some of the traditional Christian language, I think, is a little more reserved there, and even though it draws ever so near, even if it's a paper-thin distinction, we'll put it there in the West, whereas in the East, I think, and if I'm misrepresenting, correct me, but there's more of a sense where that identification where those distinctions are blurred or lost.
Yeah.
And I think Jung
That's great.
really is
Yeah.
more Western in that respect,
Right.
and would say, you know, be careful to avoid over-identification where the ego actually gets, in a sense, swallowed up and lost
Right.
in the identification with the self. That there's a dynamic there. It's a mystery. We are both and.
Yeah.
We are our local self that is growing, and yet at the deepest part of our being, this mystery that's unknowable, we are that.
Yeah.
And it's both and.
Do you guys get that distinction? I remember a great Buddha quote that if you see the Buddha in the road, run him down, right? Because anything objectified would not be, you know, you are the Buddha, so you can run down the one that you see because you're not at the eye yet. But what I'm hearing you saying is that there is always, Marcus Borg talks about it as sort of a thin veil between us and the holy. And there's always this little bit of difference there. That's what I'm hearing you say a little bit.
That's right.
Let's shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about, you talk about the shadow side a lot, and you imply that God's, which is sort of, I don't know if you guys triggered on this one, but God's mental health, so to speak, is sort of tied into ours, right? God needs us.
That was one of the most provocative things I said. And you got it.
I triggered on it. I'm like, what? God's got a problem and I'm helping him work it out, or her work it out? That's interesting.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about why? I mean, that seems so contrived to me. What do you mean God has a problem? And I mean, is there some, does that relate to this whole shadow thing, or you sort of lost me?
It certainly does. And
Why don't you talk about that?
Jung's use of the word God, you have to be careful when a psychologist talks about God, because he's really not talking theologically. He's talking psychologically. And he's in a sense challenging our notions and our conceptions of the ultimate reality. And what Jung says is, from an experiential point of view, reality is conflicted. And it's all over the map. It doesn't adhere to, it's not a gentleman. You know, I mean, it blesses and curses. It provides nourishment and earthquakes. And, you know, there is a division within reality itself, which is also the psyche itself is fragmented. And that is, in a sense, a reflection of a larger fragmentation. You know, this is a dramatic way of saying things, but he's pointing to process. That the process of our own individual healing is in some way mirrors a larger process. If you want to call it evolution, you know, that's fine. A larger cosmic process of the cosmos seeming to be healing itself as well.
Right. So I mean, I hear a lot of this as well, you know, where does love begin? First you love yourself, and then you can begin to experience love at a grander level. What I'm hearing you say to some degree is that Jung's concept of God is really an extension of the human psyche, and so as we begin to heal ourselves, God is healing.
Yes, God
Being
is
healed.
invested in the human story,
Right,
to the
'cause-
point where it is actually God's own story.
Yeah. For Jung, is there an actual objectified, would Jung say, yeah, there is an objective God out there? He would say, absolutely not. That it is always a full extension of the human.
Well, Jung was a wily fella, and he couldn't be nailed down. You know, when somebody asked
You're not going to answer this question, are you? Are you? You know, you are a wily fella, wily guy. Just answer yes or no, Randy.
When somebody asked him if he believed in God, he said, "Believe? I don't have to believe. I know."
Yeah, that's slippery. How would you respond to that?
Well, I would say that
is there an external reality to which, you know, whether we can engage it or not, is there something out there, or is it all in here?
I think it goes in both directions equally.
You guys are really bad.
So let me go.
So you're gonna have to unpack that. You guys satisfied with that answer?
In other words, it depends. If you spell cosmos with a C, it's external. If you spell it with a K, I don't know if you knew this or not, but in the Greek tradition, cosmos, K, means external and internal.
Yeah.
What's the midpoint? Our skin. So in other words, there's an infinite expanse, and outwardly and inwardly. So this then goes, when you apply Buddhist teachings to much of what Randy just said, by the way, I agree with almost everything you said right there, except that we run the risk of allowing we sometimes divide it into small self and big self, the small self being our egoically bound, libidinal, gotta know, our identification. The big self would be what's beyond that. In other words, what's beyond our concept of God is God. Our concept of God is still God, but it's limited by our concept.
Right.
So what happens then is, if we start conceptualizing God and labeling it and saying this is what God is, this is what God is not, God is good, God is not. If this happens, that means there's no God. When we do that, what we've done is we've created the limited view of the small self and turned it into something that thinks it sees things in absolute terms.
Yeah.
And that's pathological. That's dangerous. That's why when someone actually has an enlightenment experience, one of the most important things that can happen is for them to be at the foot of a master, somebody that knows what's going on, because that awakening experience tends to fixate the person wherever they happen to be. Charles Manson himself has, he said that, he had several awakening experiences, and what did he realize? That there really is no good and bad. There is no right or wrong. So guess what? That means there are no rules. Well, guess the thing that you can learn from that disaster is that here's somebody who had the awakening experience, who had no ethical structure with which to use as a container for it, so that ego could not, as you said so nicely, ego could not jump in, right? So it's a real trick. I mean, I believe very strongly, and this is why I think tradition, lots of people are arguing, let's just get rid of tradition. They're all saying the same thing. No, they're not. They're not all saying the same thing, and there's incredible value in having systems in place to create containers for what's bound to start happening much more. So I think it would be